Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. On this episode of Chain Reaction, I speak with Rob Lee, a fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program, and also a PhD student researching Russian defense policy at King's College, London. The discussion touches on Rob's recent report, Russia's Coercive Diplomacy, Why Did the Kremlin Mass Its Forces Near Ukraine, which you can find on the FPRI website. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Rob Lee, a PhD candidate at King's College and also a fellow at FPRI's Eurasia program. And we are talking about Rob's latest report, Russia's Coercive Diplomacy. Rob, it's good to have you back on the show.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so, this report's really interesting because it's retrospective. It's looking at something that happened a few months back, but I think that has a lot of applicability and lessons learned for Russian foreign policy, particularly Russian defense policy. And so we're going to be talking about the buildup of Russian forces on the borders of Ukraine between March and April 2021. So if you can just give the listeners a little sense of what was going on around that time and while a lot of people were collectively freaking out, I think it can set the stage for the conversation.
So basically, in March, starting in March, it went until April, Russia conducted a large military buildup near the border of Ukraine. And so this was taking part, a lot of the equipment moved to Crimea, some of it moved to Ukraine's southeastern and northeastern borders with Russia, including where the Donbass is. And basically, it was a large amount of equipment, and it was very atypical, right? It wasn't normal, which is why it aroused so much kind of concern. So obviously, anytime there's a lot of movement of military equipment around Ukraine, it's always concerned because it's an ongoing conflict. And obviously, Russia, they don't like to always telegraph their moves when they escalate there. But in this case, there are a lot of things that were really, really kind of unique and different. So first off, the size was the big thing. So the estimates while the buildup was happening, Ukrainian officials said that they estimated that Russia had amassed about 110,000 or up to 120,000 troops near the borders, and I think they estimated they estimated a certain number of battalion tactical groups, BTGs. I forgot what they said, but U.S. officials reported that they estimated about 80,000 Russian troops and about 50 or 45 or 50 Russian BTGs. And as background, so battalion tactical groups are kind of one of the normal ways of counting or assessing Russian kind of military strength. The BTG, when Russia fought in Donbass, they usually fought with BTGs, where basically a regiment or brigade would form one or two BTGs and would send those to fight. It doesn't necessarily mean Russia would do that in a future conflict. They might, use the entire regiment or entire brigade, but it's something they had used before. But anyway, BTGs, they're constant readiness units. So they're units that are set up fully with contract soldiers, so no conscripts, and it's supposed to be able to be moved, I think operational within like a day or two. So basically, this is Russia's permanent readiness force for any kind of contingencies. And so Shoigu gave the last figure we just got about a month ago. Shoigu said that Russia has 168 constant readiness BTGs, and the estimates from U.S. officials is that basically about 50 BTGs were near the border with Ukraine, which basically is about a third of Russia's ground force kind of combat power, right? And so it's a significant amount of combat power. It's about 10 to 50% of their total manpower. So it's a significant amount of force. And it was also a lot of really kind of unique and interesting things that have been moved. So one, you had a lot of things being moved from different military districts, including the Central Military District. So a number of systems and troops from the Central Military District's 41st Combined Arms Army were moved, including Iskander-M, short-range ballistic missiles. And then you had a number of things. So basically, the way the Russian military position is, on Ukraine's border, the northeast corner of Ukraine's border is part of the Russian Western Military District, and on the southern and southern east and southeastern border, it's the Southern Military District. Well, both of those areas had a build-up too. So a lot of the Central Military District equipment was moved to Voronezh, which is on Ukraine's northeastern border. And then in the Southern Military District, a lot of the equipment they have that's based in the Caucasus near the border of Georgia, a lot of that was moved over to Crimea and to the southeast border too. And it wasn't just light equipment. It was like heavy artillery, like the 2S7 Pioner Malka, 2S4 Tulpan heavy mortars. So a lot of kind of unique equipment, but a lot of it was the really concerning part was if Russia wanted to actually conduct another ground invasion, a lot of this equipment you expect Russia would use, right? So stuff that if they're going to hit a fortified defensive position, this is the kind of stuff they'd bring along. This kind of artillery they bring along. We saw a lot of really heavy engineering equipment, MICLICs, things of that nature being moved. And the VDV, they moved a lot of stuff too, is also from the Western Military District, including units that are famous for taking part in the fight in the Donbass in 2014. So basically, you saw a huge amount of equipment being moved, a number of helicopter brigades. A lot of those were moved over to Crimea. You also saw 4 large landing ships from the Baltic Fleet, Northern Fleet. Those were moved from Baltic Fleet, Northern Fleet to the Black Sea, and then the Caspian Flotilla sent basically all of their, I think all of their landing crafts and a number of their artillery boats made the transition into the Black Sea too. And so what's unique about this is that Russia had the most naval equipment in the Black Sea they've had since the fall of the Soviet Union. So basically, there's a lot of kind of alarm bells in terms of Russia had a lot of military capability there. That they wanted to do something, right? They had the capacity to do it. And so I think they had, once they massed all those ships together, I think they had something like 8 or 9 large landing ships, right? Another like 8 or 9 landing crafts. It's pretty significant amphibious capability. You had significant a number of helicopters. So from Crimea, you could have conducted an amphibious landing. You could have sustained that with helicopter support, a variety of other things. And they moved a lot of fixed-wing aviation too, Su-25s, Su-34s. They moved A-50 AWACS. Anyway, long story short, they moved a lot of equipment, right? And it wasn't just one form or another. It was quite comprehensive. They moved it from other military districts. And basically, throughout this period, they didn't really explain what they were doing. So the commander of the Southern Military District, Alexander Dvornikov, he mentioned at some point in March that they're going to do a military exercise, but really scant on details. And basically, a lot of this kind of was similar to what you might think, what might see in the annual operational strategic exercise the Russian military does. And so every year they rotate it. So every military district does it at once every fourth year. This year is going to be Zapad in the Western Military District. But that's pretty much the only time you see significant equipment move from different military districts to one. And the size of this was really abnormal for anything that wasn't one of these large exercises. And what was also unique about this was that Southern Military District had just done Kavkaz 2020 in last September. And so of all the military districts, they were the most prepared, right, to conduct these kind of large operations because they just done this training exercise. And so they were the least in need of this opportunity to conduct another kind of training exercise if it was just an exercise, right? So anyway, all this stuff together, it was unique, and a lot of it, and Russia basically wasn't explaining it, right? They weren't giving a good explanation. Before the big annual exercises, they almost always bring in the foreign defense attaches. They give them a briefing. They explain, the scenario, what training area is going to be used, all that kind of stuff. They didn't do that this time. All right, so they didn't do that. It was kind of quite deliberate. At the same time, there are all these videos on TikTok, on Telegram, other social media accounts that are showing the Russians were taking videos of the trains moving this equipment. For the most part, the equipment was not. There were no tarps over it. They weren't hiding it. So you could see exactly what kind of stuff it was. And again, it wasn't just like battalion level equipment. It was division or army or district level assets, right? I mean, including some of the C2, the artillery, other kind of things. And that again, all of that is unique and not, something that's normal to see. So anyway, basically throughout this period, Russia didn't explain what was going on. They're clearly doing something that was not normal, right? And it was being massed near Ukraine. And so all of those kind of concerning. There's often most years there's often a number of people or articles come out saying, Russia's going to invade here or here. Usually they don't really give good reasonings why, but this time something was different. And so anyway, it was a concerning kind of event, and that's why it kind of got all the attention it did.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember this obviously, and I've attended a couple of events and retrospectives about it. Can you talk a little bit about how it was being interpreted? As you go through your paper, that there were three sort of baseline assumptions about what it could be, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it ultimately escalated to the point where this high-level phone calls going back and forth between American and Russian senior officials trying to discern intent about what exactly was going on.
Sure. So basically, there were kind of three, overall kind of explanations for what this was. One is that it was just a training exercise. And that one, basically I mentioned kind of the reasons why it was a bad kind of explanation, right? It was too large. Russia wasn't explaining it. There wasn't much information. They'd just done CONFCOS 2020. They didn't really need to do this again. So for a variety of reasons, right, it was not a unique normal training exercise. And if they're going to do a unique training exercise, you expect them to provide more information so as to not be concerning, to not concern their Western neighbors, right? They were happy to be to raise alarm bells this time. So that explanation really didn't really make much sense. The other one was basically this was a prelude to starting a war, right, or another Russian ground invasion, whether in the Donbass or a movement from Crimea. So this is kind of thrown out there all the time, right? And again, a lot of times the reasoning isn't really that strong. Why they try to explain why Russia would restart the war, try to escalate it. And so there are a couple explanations why Russia would want to conduct another ground invasion. One, there's always been this idea of this land bridge they needed to conduct between Crimea and the Donbass, near Mariupol and the southern coast of Ukraine. That's been floated around for 6-7 years. Never really made sense. Militarily didn't really make sense. Basically if you had this thin amount of terrain, right? You basically leave yourself quite vulnerable. Plus, Russia, they already built the bridge in Crimea, so they don't really need that for normal logistical reasons. So that never really made much sense. The one explanation that made some sense was that the Crimea's had a really significant issue with water issues, where they've had some significant droughts. The agriculture in Crimea has been has really suffered, and basically a lot of it's because Ukraine is a canal that used to feed into Crimea from Ukraine, and Ukraine cut it off after Russia seized the peninsula. So that's been mentioned a bunch of times. But but again, in terms of explanations, though, so Russia they're putting a lot of money into some infrastructure projects to improve that, new piping, some other things. The other issue, though, is that basically it's a really complex problem to solve, and a ground invasion is a kind of questionable way of doing it, right? Because if you do a ground invasion, you basically seize more Ukrainian territory, right? But even in that case, there's no guarantee that canal you can open it up again and it's ready to operate, right? It might take a lot of money to get that operational again. You'd have to occupy a lot of terrain, and there isn't really a good territorial kind of barrier like there is with Crimea right now. So it makes it harder to kind of hold it. And of course, a new ground invasion, it throws into it means you probably have more sanctions. It throws into doubt the Nord Stream pipeline, right, or would have at the time. It would have raised a lot of issues. It would have hurt Russian relations with the EU and other countries. And again, the question is, was this necessary, right? Is this worth that? And it never really kind of made sense for the most part, kind of cost-benefit analysis. So that was always kind of a questionable explanation for it. And also, the way this buildup happens, it really wasn't in line with previous Russian uses of force, right? So, one of the kind of common things that's mentioned about when Russia's invaded places is that it catches by surprise, right? They're pretty good about catching people by surprise when they do this. So before they intervened in Syria, right, not many people predicted that. Not many people predicted what they're going to do in Crimea and Donbass. In this case, the buildup was very obvious, right? So it was on trains. All these videos were being posted. There are a lot of things they could have done to improve operational security. It seemed as though they really didn't care, right? And of course, they could have flown a lot of this equipment to Crimea too, which meant there's less chance of it being videotaped. Anyway, they didn't do that, so it was clear they're happy with it being pretty public, and by making it public, and there's also a lot of rhetoric coming from Russian officials. So they're saying a lot of things about Ukraine. They're threatening Ukraine, and again, all this, if you're thinking strategically, if you want to, start a new invasion, why would you give the country a heads up ahead of time? Because it gave Ukraine time to call up reserves, to move around forces, to do all these kind of preparations, which you'd never do if you actually wanted to conduct a ground invasion, right? So all those kind of reasons aside, right, it didn't make much sense. And then there was an event. There was a explosion in the Donbass in a town, and it killed a girl. I forget the exact situation, but this happened during the buildup. And basically, Russia's often used for propaganda purposes, or they've used justifications of saying Ukraine is targeting civilians in the Donbass, and we have to defend them and so on. That would have been a sufficient explanation or justification if Russia wanted to conduct an invasion, right? For at least for Russian domestic opinion, that would have been enough saying Ukraine, kill this girl. The actual facts point that it was likely was the Russian officials said that basically it was from a Ukrainian, I think TB2 or artillery, but basically it was far from the front. It was pretty clear that's not what happened. But either way, they could have used it as a justification. They didn't choose to. And again, that kind of comes back to saying, okay, all these kind of things show that Russia didn't really want to conduct an invasion. And so basically left to us the third explanation was that this is about signaling, about some kind of coercive signaling, coercive diplomacy, bargaining. And basically within that, there were two kind of, arguments. Either it's about compellence or deterrence, right? And so if it was compellence, that meant that Russia was trying to force either Ukraine or the U.S., right? It could have been, the target could have been different, to change its behavior. And the other one was deterrence, right? It was a demonstration of saying, showing, hey, we have the capability to deter, a Ukrainian invasion or a, U.S. response, and we had the willingness to do so by, showing what we're doing. And so basically, I think a lot of people ultimately thought this was about compellence, right? Especially after the summit, especially after what seemed as though the Biden administration kind of addressed this and kind of made maybe not a compromise to meet with Putin and to give him the summit, which is something that Russian officials always like to see, to be treated as a great power. So that was one of the arguments I think a lot of people accepted, but from my perspective, I don't think it's as good an explanation as deterrence. And so basically, the reason why for compellence, typically you have very specific demands you're making, right? So it's a specific demands. Typically you provide a timeline. It's usually a short timeline, and it's some kind of threat where it says, right, if you don't do this, we will do these things, right? We will start inflicting pain, and we will alter your cost-benefit analysis so that you will realize it's better for you to do what we want than to be obstinate and to say no. The problem was we heard a variety of kind of explanations of why Russia was building out their forces. So Shoigu, during this time, the Russian defense minister, he mentioned NATO. He kept mentioning the big NATO exercise that happened in May and June, and buildup of NATO forces in Europe. So that was the thing that he kept harping on in the background of this buildup. Dmitry Kozak, a assistant to Putin, mentioned basically fears of Ukrainian offensive. He said Ukraine was building up forces. That's why they're doing it. Vladimir Shamanov, who is the former head of the VDV, now a Duma MP, he also mentioned kind of basically that they were building up based on Ukrainian force dispositions near the Donbass, and basically any kind of pulling back would be based on whatever Ukraine did militarily. And then Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, she mentioned basically Ukraine's failure to live up to Minsk agreements, and she also mentioned threats about Ukraine trying to join NATO. Anyway, ultimately what it meant was you had these a variety of different kind of demands, right? And first off, it wasn't clear, was this about NATO or was this about Ukraine? And if it was, what specifically is the issue you want the target to change? It wasn't very clear. It was a bunch of different kind of demands and just kind of typical kind of Russian official rhetoric, which complains about Ukraine and NATO actions. And so again, if this is compellence, well, compellence is designed to change a specific kind of behavior, and if you're not being clear what behavior that is or who the target is, well, you can't really achieve that. So that was one reason why I didn't think it was a good argument. A second part, so they basically Russia held this big exercise on April 22nd in Crimea. Right after that, Sergei Shoigu announced, they're going to pull back forces. They didn't pull all of it out. They pulled some back. A lot of it was left. Some of it was still left until the Zapad exercise, but they started pulling some back. And at a minimum, they pulled back the rhetoric. Like they made it clear that they weren't about to invade. But because they left a lot of equipment there, a lot of units there, if the summit had been what Russia was trying to achieve, well, why didn't they move more of that stuff back after kind of Biden had called Putin and said, let's have a meeting, let's do this, right? So that kind of didn't really track exactly. And then the other question was, why didn't we see other kind of activities you'd expect in a compellence campaign, right? Why was it just Ukraine? So in the last few years, there have been a lot of increasing kind of aggressive intercepts of Russian fighters with NATO aircrafts. You see this in the sea as well with Russian destroyers. Sometimes they've had really close calls with NATO or U.S. Ships. And in Syria, there are a number of kind of really significant incidents especially last summer in August, where Russian troops were ramming U.S. vehicles because both sides basically were trying to demarcate where the other side couldn't go in northeast Syria. And there are a couple kind of confrontations that led to a couple of U.S. Soldiers being injured. We didn't see any of that recently. So none of that was going on once Biden came into office. And it's kind of strange you expect to see that if there's about a compellence campaign, right? Why keep it localized in one area and why not these other aspects too? The other issue was cyber attacks. There were a variety of cyber issues, ransomware attacks, quite famously in the spring. But the reporting said, at least the news, and a lot of stuff continued after the summit, right? And so, again, if that had been the objective, that this is exactly what Russia wanted to achieve, you expect them to pull back on these things, right? Instead of continue to kind of conduct them before and after, right? So anyway, there are a lot of things that are kind of surprising. And there are a lot of things, if this is about compellence, that they could have done too, right? So they could have done kind of limited escalations, right, where they could have shot down Ukrainian TB2 UCAVs, right, as a simple step where it's not killing anyone, but it's a way of escalating a little bit, showing, hey, we're going to keep escalating if you don't do what we want to do. They could have increased artillery strikes. They could have increased the use of anti-tank guided missiles, of snipers. The Russian SOF have operated in Donbass. And there's no indication that really happened, right? There was increase in fighting in Donbass during this time, but it wasn't obvious as Russians being used or what role they're playing. So anyway, there are kind of a lot of things. If it was about compellence, you kind of would have expected to see, right? You expected clear demands. You would expected maybe see some other measures taken, and you didn't see that. So all of that kind of led me to believe, okay, compellence probably isn't the best argument. And then right after this occurred, right after Shoigu announced that there's going to be a pullback, President Putin addressed the Russian Federal Assembly and gave a speech, and then Dmitry Medvedev, the former prime minister, former president, now is the chair of the Russian National Security Council. He also released an article on Sputnik, and they both kind of provided some ideas of what was motivating them. And so Putin, his speech, first off, a lot of people expected, really concerned, because this before the poll, and they expected, okay, is he going to announce an invasion? What is he going to announce? And basically, his speech was very heavy on domestic issues, right? It was about price increases and all that kind of stuff. It was probably the most boring address he's given in years. And the only times he mentioned foreign events, he mentioned Ukraine in passing, but his emphasis was really about the U.S. It wasn't about Ukraine, it was about the U.S. And what he mentioned is he mentioned red lines. He basically said, without specifying anyone, he said basically, we have red lines. If you cross them, we will respond, and we'll respond in an asymmetric way. And again, what has appeared to me was, and this is also kind of mentioned by other Russian officials, that basically Russian officials are trying to say, if the U.S. continues anti-Russian policies, and they mention these as sanctions, they mention this as possibly in Ukraine to NATO, a few other things, and again during this time, the President Biden had called Putin a killer. Like the rhetoric had kind of increased. There had also been some new sanctions from the Biden administration on Russia. So the number of things that Russia at least saw as escalatory, right? And they saw the Biden administration as escalating Russian-U.S. relations. And so a lot of this was a response, basically, that the way I read it was that Russia, we're willing to escalate militarily in Ukraine in response to anti-Russian policies, as we perceive them, if the U.S. takes, right? So if we see more sanctions, right, maybe we'll escalate in Ukraine. That's why you mentioned asymmetric a response. And basically, when you look at Ukraine, and it's quite clear to us, I think, during the buildup, Russia's in a more powerful position there than we are, at least in the U.S., right? Because Russia has stronger military force. They're willing to use military force. Ultimately, it's sufficiently domestically popular in Russia that it's not a problem for them to do so. And so Russia can escalate there if they want to, or they don't have to. But if they do escalate, there's no really great response from the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't want to ultimately send troops to die fighting for Ukraine. And ultimately, the responses from the U.S. have been typically not really that strong. It's been basically kind of rhetoric. It's been saying we're concerned, right? There's that often kind of adage that response from EU or U.S. leaders, oh, we're concerned about this, but we're not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And so basically, it would make the U.S. kind of look weak or NATO look weak if Russia escalated and the response wasn't really that strong. And then at the same time, Medvedev's his article, basically he looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis and he tries to kind of flesh out what he drew as a lesson from that. And basically he emphasizes the need to compromise, he emphasizes the need to not escalate things. He mentioned sanctions, he mentions kind of the rhetoric from the Biden administration. And ultimately he tried to argue that the Soviet Union, they only deployed missiles there in response to aggressive action taken by the U.S., right? And so it's kind of a revisionist approach. But basically, it's very clear, both speeches, the rhetoric made much more sense in a deterrence kind of setting than as compellence, right? It's justification. And again, they were pretty specific about mentioning things that the Biden had said. One of them was that Russia would pay a price, mentioning a few other things like that. But it was very clear that one, the target was the U.S., wasn't Ukraine, and two, that this is more about we want to develop some kind of status quo, some kind of understanding. We think you're escalating a situation. We're willing to escalate as well, and we want the U.S. to kind of pull back. And so that was kind of my argument was that the messaging made more sense in terms of deterrence. The buildup made more sense in terms of deterrence, and that basically that's a stronger argument than compellence.
Well, as we wrap up here, maybe I'll ask one last question looking forward. I know that you've also done a lot of work on Zapad 2021, which sometimes ignites some of the same chatter, right? Which is trying to infer or discern Russian intentions, from their own buildup to carry out this military exercise. Given your conclusions, and people can read them in the report in far more depth than you explained here, are there any broad lessons to be learned looking forward, and any sort of thoughts you have about Zapad as it looms?
So I guess first, if the concern is that it's a prelude to Russia invading somewhere like the Baltics, that is not a concern that I have, right? So again, a lot of this comes back to I think when you talk to Russian officials or Russian kind of foreign policy people, and you mention concerns that Russia might invade Estonia or some country like that, they always kind of come back and say, what are you thinking about? Like that's not something that's really debated or thought about in Russia. So I don't think that's a concern of mine, because it wouldn't make sense. And if there's one kind of consistent element of Russian foreign policy on Putin, is that Putin's been willing to use military force, but he's not been willing to use military force against a NATO member. Right, he's been willing to prevent countries that might become NATO members to join NATO, but he's not been willing to test Article 5, because ultimately he doesn't think it's worth it. It's worth it. And so in that regard, I'm not as concerned about it. Right, obviously I think what's going to be unique this time. So Zapad 2017, there's a lot of concern before that. Right, a lot of it turned out to not be as nearly as concerning as it was, and the exercise actually was kind of quite smaller than a lot of people expected it to be. This time it's going to be different, right? It's going to be much larger. They already mentioned, so the total force that they mentioned was it's going to be 200,000, right? It's probably some creative accounting. It doesn't mean all those guys are going to be involved in the Baltics, right? They're going to be in different areas. The size is already bigger. The number of Russian forces in Belarus are already bigger. So a lot of things have changed. The strategic situation has also changed. All right, so Zapad 2017, today, right, Belarus and Russian relations are different. Obviously, it's been a chaotic year this last year in Belarus after the elections, the crackdown, the Coercive affair in May, and now Belarus is trying to force migrants into Lithuania, all these kind of things. Right, Belarus is Lukashenko used to try to play off the EU and Russia. At this point, that's it's no longer something that he can do. He's very now dependent on Russia because there's no international support for him. Belarus is increasingly a pariah state. And so that situation is different. We know that before this, Russia has always wanted to increase its kind of military presence or its ability to use Belarus in military situations. I think we look at Zapad 2021. It'll probably be different to Zapad 2017 in that regard. There are a number of kind of interesting things to look out for. One of the big things, and it's already been kind of indicated, is that I think the emphasis in this one, all the exercises, all the operational exercises, they always involve defeating a conventional enemy. It's always going to be a big, showing of mechanized tank units with heavy use of fires, artillery, all that kind of stuff. It's always involved. But I think there's going to be a greater emphasis this time on combating a kind of color revolution type scenario. And especially when you look at Belarus, obviously it's quite clear that Lukashenko's main concern is domestic kind of threats of having and allowing any kind of domestic protests against the regime. I think one of the things we might see is that Russia might play a more integrated role in putting down any kind of domestic uprising in Belarus. It already looks as though it won't just be the Russian military, but a large use of the Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia, possibly FSB, possibly other kind of Russian government units as part of this. So, I think that's going to be a kind of key difference. Is there's going to be more of an emphasis on putting down a kind of domestic kind of revolt of some kind, and the scenario will obviously blame it on other countries. So it's going to be different. It's going to be large, and I expect there's going to be a lot of electronic warfare use. So the Baltics will probably have issues with their cell phones, navigation, that kind of stuff. So it's gonna be interesting exercise to watch. But the big thing is that in Zapad 2017, I think Russia didn't want to be seen as too aggressive with the beginning of the Trump administration. I think this time it's gonna be different. Right? The relationship is worse, and I think Russia will be much more keen on demonstrating its conventional capabilities in a scenario of a Russia-NATO conflict. So it's going to be much more extensive than the last Zapad. I think we're going to see a lot of new capabilities. I've already mentioned a lot of them. So it would be interesting to see. But again, a part of the exercises is just for training. Part of it is for inspecting to make sure that military units at all levels can conduct their missions. But part of it is also there's an element of political signaling, and so we're definitely going to see a signaling aspect to this. And given the big buildup we had near Ukraine in March and April, which again never really ended because a lot of those units remained there since then, we're going to see a big element of signaling as well to the U.S., to NATO, to all these kind of countries.
Well, Rob, that was great. Thanks for coming on the show. And if people want more of this discussion, please read the report. You can find it on FPRI's website. We have it linked in the show notes below. But it's you can also find it by Googling. It's Russia's Coercive Diplomacy. Why did the Kremlin mass its forces near Ukraine? So with that, Rob, thanks for joining, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.